Today we're going to deal with the lymphatic system, and you will see in a moment how the lymphatic system is also related to the, in part of its functions is related to the cardiovascular system. That is, it has circulatory function as well. But this is not the only function of the lymphatic system. The lymphatic system has another important function that is in the immune system. So it's logically that we study the lymphatic system after the cardiovascular system. The lymphatic system consists of organs, consists of vessels, and the fluid, which is the lymph fluid. This fluid is actually, it's similar to the plasma, blood plasma. It's very closely similar to blood plasma, and most of the time. Remember that when we dealt with blood, we mentioned that the blood is formed of 55% of plasma and about 45% or a little bit less of red of cells. 45% are cells. Most of them, 99% of them, are red blood cells, and the others are white blood cells and platelets. So 55% of the constituents of the blood are plasma, and these are filtered. This plasma is filtered into the interstitial spaces and becomes the interstitial fluid. So the interstitial fluid is almost the same as that of plasma, and some of this interstitial fluid returns through the capillary circulation, and the other returns through the lymph. That's why the lymph also participates as part of the cardiovascular system. So we have again organs, we have vessels. We're going to talk about these vessels in a moment. We have the lymph, which is the fluid, which is very similar to the interstitial fluid. It is, most of the time it's clear, but sometimes in certain places it is milky. It's not yellow transparent like in the plasma. And the red bone marrow. Of the organs involved, and we are going to study them in much more details, we have the thymus. We have studied the thymus before as part of the endocrine system, and now we are going to study it as part of the lymphatic system or the immune system. And then we have the spleen, we have lymph nodes and the nodules, and we will see what is the difference between a lymph node and lymphatic nodules. Nodules like the tonsils, the adenoids, and the Peyer's patches. Now, so returning back to the first point that I mentioned about the functions of the lymphatic system, it drains excess interstitial fluid. If you look at this diagram, the red side and the blue side represent the vascular bed, which is the capillary bed. These are capillaries through which exchange of substances take place, and they are in close or intimate contact to cells. So the yellowish structures are cells, and in between the cells, the space is the interstitial space or the extracellular space in between these cells. And so the blood is filtered here, and the plasma will go into the interstitial fluid, and then some of the plasma and other substances like metabolites, like CO2, will return back to the vascular circulation, but the remaining will return back through another group of capillaries, and these are lymphatic capillaries. So the lymphatic capillaries will help in draining excess interstitial fluid and plasma proteins from tissue spaces, especially the plasma proteins, which are larger particles, and it will be difficult for them to return back to the circulation directly, so they will go into the lymphatic system. So in this respect, the lymphatic system is closely related to the cardiovascular system. It also transports not only the interstitial fluid, but the dietary lipids, the lipids that are absorbed from the small intestine. These are large molecules, not only the lipids, but lipid-soluble vitamins. These are large molecules. It will be difficult for them to find their way to the capillaries of the vascular system. But it will be easier for them to find their way through the lymphatic capillaries. And in a moment, we will see why it is easier for large molecules to pass through the lymphatics and not into the capillaries of the vascular circulation. And it is these dietary fats that will make the lymph that is absorbed from the intestine, it will make it milky in color. So that's why these vessels, these capillaries, lymphatic vessels that drain the small intestine are called lacteals. Lact means milk, so like lactose. They are called or lactation. So lact is related to milk because the fluid there, the lymphatic fluid, is not transparent or yellowish like lymphatic fluid elsewhere. It is full with dietary fat, so it is milky in color. And the other function here is that it facilitates immune responses. So it recognizes the microbes, it recognizes abnormal cells like malignant cells, and it responds. The response is either a direct response by phagocytizing them, like macrophages phagocytize, or by killing them by killer cells, or by, like lymphocytes, will develop into plasma cells, and we have probably mentioned that before when we dealt with blood. And these plasma cells, they will produce antibodies that will kill the antigens. So the response could be specific by producing like antibodies and specific killer cells, or it could be non-specific by phagocytizing. And this is the other main function of the lymphatic system. So the lymphatic vessels, they start as capillaries. The difference between these capillaries and the blood capillaries is that these capillaries, the lymphatic capillaries, are close-ended. They are blind-ended, okay? Because they are not continuous with other capillaries. It is unlike, for example, here, the capillaries of the blood. From one side there are arterioles, and from the other side there are venules. But the lymphatic capillaries are blind-ended, and in structure they have this structure of veins. They are very, very thin-walled. Even they are thinner than the vein. We mentioned about the structure of the wall of the vein last time. We said that it's much thinner than that of the artery. And the second thing that resembles the veins here is that these vessels, they have valves which allow unidirectional flow of blood, like the valves that are present in the veins. So here, the vessels, the lymphatic vessels in general, they are more or less similar to veins, but they are thinner in wall, they have more valves. The capillaries are blind-ended, and like other capillaries, they are lined with endothelial cells, flat epithelial cells, which are called epithelial cells. But here, the epithelial cells are overlapping each other, like shingles of the roof. So they overlap each other. That's why they overlap each other in such a way that creates a valve that allows the passage of fluid from the interstitial space into the capillary. So you can see here the overlap. Fluid can pass in between these endothelial cells. It can push one endothelial cells and pass in between to go into the lumen of the capillary. But if the pressure inside the capillary is increased, then the fluid cannot go back, because the way that these endothelial cells overlap, it's like a one-way valve. Okay, so that's how the fluid gains access into the interstitial fluid gains access here. And because there are gaps here, therefore large particles can access the lymphatic circulation. It can access the lymphatic vessels easier than they access the capillaries of the blood. Okay, because the endothelial cells can move, they are overlapped, and they can move and create a one-way valve. The other thing is that because this is a very thin wall, then you can expect that if there is pressure outside, it will easily collapse. But what prevents this very thin vessel from collapsing is that there are elastic fibers here. Okay, so these elastic fibers, which are called anchoring filaments, they are connected on one side to the endothelial cells, and on the other side to the tissue itself. And therefore, they will prevent these capillaries from getting collapsed. Okay? So that's the mechanism how the interstitial fluid can gain access into these capillaries. Capillaries will become larger and larger and form vessels, lymphatic vessels. Lymphatic vessels will form trunks, and then they will form ducts, and then the lymph ultimately should end into the bloodstream. So it ends into the veins. As we will see that there are trunks or ducts, they open here at the junction of the internal jugular vein and the subclavian vein, returning the lymphatic fluid, returning it back to the blood so that the contents will circulate with the cardiovascular system. That's why there is no circulation of lymph. Lymph has one way, and the lymphatic capillaries, they are blind-ended, because the lymph is going to drain into the blood circulation, into the venous side of the blood circulation. Okay? Now this is to show you, we will study that when we study the GI tract during this week, maybe the first or second lecture of the GI. And you can see these are the finger-like projections of the small intestine, which are called the villi. And the core of the villus, there's a lymphatic vessel, the green one, and there are capillaries, the blue and red ones. And these vessels are called the lacteals because it is here, they are stuffed with the dietary fat that is absorbed into from the intestine. This fat cannot directly gain access to the blood capillaries because there is no such mechanism of overlapping endothelial cells. It's easy here for it to gain access to the lymphatic vessels and then will return back to the vascular bed. So these vessels are called the lacteals, and the fluid inside them is milky. It's different from the fluid, the lymphatic fluid that is present in other lymph vessels, and has a special name called chyle. Then, as I said, the lymphatic vessels will form lymph trunks and lymph ducts. So on the right side of the body, there is a right lymph duct, a very small duct that is formed by the union of three trunks. One of them brings the lymph from the right side of the head and neck, the other one from the right side of the thorax, and the other one from the right upper limb. So in other words, the right upper quadrant of the body, if you just imagine that, like the body is in two halves, the diaphragm separates the body into two halves, upper half and lower half. Then the upper half, the right side of the upper half, is drained by three lymph trunks that unite to form a single, small, tiny duct that opens at the junction of the right subclavian vein and right internal jugular vein, returning the lymph to the vascular circulation. On the left side, on the other hand, we have the thoracic duct. This is the largest lymph duct in the body, and it can be easily seen during dissection. It drains 3/4 of the body, as you can see. It drains the entire body below the diaphragm, whether right or left, and it drains the left upper quadrant of the body by the same three lymphatic channels that drain on the right side. But this one drains on the left side, the same angle, we call it the venous angle, between the internal jugular vein and the subclavian vein is the opening of the thoracic duct. Now this duct, it begins in the abdomen. In the abdomen, there's an elongated sac, which is about 2 inches in length. It's called the cisterna chyli, because it contains the chyle. Cisterna means like a cyst or a sac. Chyli, the chyle, remember I said that the chyle is the lymph that is absorbed from the intestine and that is stuffed with fat. They call it chyle. So that's why it's called the cisterna chyli. And from the cisterna chyli, thoracic duct ascends up, goes to the thorax, and then goes to the left and opens here after it receives the lymph vessels from the left upper side of the body. So in other words, the thoracic duct drains lymph from 3/4 of the body, while the right lymph duct drains the lymph from the 1/4 of the body, right upper quarter of the body. Now this will bring us to the question, how is lymph moving to the circulation against the gravity and in these thin walls? It's the same situation, almost the same situation that we have with veins, like venous blood. How does venous blood returns against the gravity? And there is no pump in the heart, which pumps the blood through the arteries, but there is no pump in the veins. There is no pump here in the lymphatic vessels. And so here there are two mechanisms. Muscles by themselves, they can act as pumps. So the muscles that are, especially the muscles of the limbs, when they move, they act as pumps. They can easily compress the lymphatic vessels or the veins, and thus help to return the venous blood or the lymph back to the heart. And this is also assisted by the presence of valves. Remember, the valves will prevent whether the venous blood or the lymph from going to the peripheral part of the body. It will only allow the squeezed content of the lymphatic vessel or the vein to go in one direction, that is toward the heart. So the muscles, the valves, and the respiratory movements, especially the diaphragm, the main respiratory muscle. As the diaphragm contracts, we have studied that before. The diaphragm is dome-shaped. When it contracts, it descends downwards. It increases intra-abdominal pressure and decreases intrathoracic pressure. As the intra-abdominal pressure is increased, it will squeeze on the vessels, on the, like cisterna chyli, for example, which forms the thoracic duct. It will squeeze on the inferior vena cava, and so it will push the blood in one direction because of the presence of the valves. So it's respiratory movements, the muscles and the valves work all together in synchrony in order to return the venous blood or the lymph to the heart and to the venous circulation. If there is excess fluid in the interstitial space, this results in a condition which is called edema, and it is an abnormal increase in the interstitial fluid. You can see here in this, like in this food, you can press on the skin and there are pits, what they call it pitting edema. There are many reasons for that, for the pitting edema, but edema is always excess fluid in the interstitial space. This fluid, which is usually drained by lymphatic vessels, it become in excess. There are many reasons for that. I'm not going to go into details, but just want to say that there is interstitial fluid, has the same constituent of the lymph. The lymph drains the interstitial fluid. So this is again the first part of the function, or the first function of the lymphatic system. The second important function is that it works as part of the immune system, and it contains the lymphocytes, are the main defense cells. Of course, they are not the only defense cells. The other defense cells are like the neutrophils, which are present in the blood, and the monocytes. But the lymphocytes are very important, especially for the specific immunity, because they will develop into either killer cells or they will develop into plasma cells that produce antibodies. So we have two types of these lymphocytes. We mentioned that before. We have the B lymphocytes and the T lymphocytes. Both of them, they develop in the bone marrow from stem cells, and the B lymphocytes, they mature in the bone marrow. So they develop and mature in the bone marrow. But the T cells, they develop in the bone marrow but mature in the thymus, hence the name T, referring to the thymus. These lymphocytes, as I said, that B will produce antibodies against specific antigens. T lymphocytes, they attack the foreign cells and cause their death. They are killer cells. Some of these, whether B or T, they can directly act and attack foreign cells, and they are short-lived, and called effector cells, but yet some of them will remain silent as memory cells. So they are still there circulating in the blood, and whenever there is another chance for the antigen to enter into the body, they can immediately attack the antigen. So they are called memory cells. So memory cells are both in the form of B lymphocytes or T lymphocytes, so as the effector cells, B lymphocytes and T lymphocytes. Now the lymphatic organs. The lymphatic organs are can be divided into two types. Let's say, functionally speaking, they are in two types. We have primary and secondary lymphatic organs. The primary lymphatic organs is where lymphocytes develop, and we have just mentioned that develop and mature. So we have just mentioned that the lymphocytes, the B lymphocytes, develop and mature in the bone marrow. So the bone marrow is a primary lymphatic organ, and the T lymphocytes develop and in the bone marrow but mature in the thymus. So the thymus is a primary lymphatic organ. Again, I repeat that primary lymphatic organs is where the lymphocytes, they develop and mature there. So both the red bone marrow and the thymus. Remember, bone marrow is two types of bone marrow. We have the red bone marrow and the yellow bone marrow. The yellow bone marrow is fat, but it can change into red bone marrow whenever there is a requirement to produce more cells. And usually it is present in the middle of long bones. The red bone marrow is present in the epiphyses of bones, long bones, and it is present in the flat bones, like the iliac crest, like in the sternum. So these are the locations of the red bone marrow, where the lymphocytes, they develop and the B lymphocytes mature there. And then we have secondary lymphatic organs and tissues, and this is where immune response is going to develop. Like these lymphocytes, the mature lymphocytes now are present in lymph nodes, they are present in lymph nodules, and whenever there's infection, then these mature lymphocytes, whether B or T lymphocytes, they are going to divide and proliferate, and they will attack the antigen in these secondary lymphoid organs, like the lymph nodes, the spleen, and the lymphatic nodules. So primary and secondary lymphoid organs. The primary is where the lymphocytes are produced, are developed and mature, and the secondary is where the reaction, the immune reaction is taking place by proliferation of mature lymphocytes. Structurally speaking, the lymphatic tissue could be diffuse lymphatic tissue or diffuse lymphatic cells, and usually these are present everywhere in the body, almost everywhere in the body. And of course, lymphatic vessels are not present in the cartilage, they are not present in the cornea. Not all the tissues, they have lymphatic vessels, but now I am talking about lymphatic cells. These are present, either diffuse everywhere in the body, or they are aggregated into nodules. These aggregates could be either in the lining of the gastrointestinal tract, or they are in the lining of the urinary tract, or in the respiratory tract. We have seen some of them when we studied the respiratory system. At the beginning of the respiratory system, there are the tonsils, like the pharyngeal tonsil, the palatine tonsil, the tubal tonsil, lingual tonsil. So they are just located under the mucosa, and they are not covered by a capsule of connective tissue. The others are encapsulated and they form the lymph nodes, and the other organs are the spleen and the thymus gland. I'm going to go into details step by step. So, like structurally speaking, the lymph cells of the lymphocytes, which are the cells of the lymphoid tissue, they are either they are dispersed or they are aggregated in non-encapsulated nodules, or they are encapsulated and they form the nodes, or there are other organs like the spleen and the thymus. Now, the lymphatic nodules, these are the concentrations of lymphatic tissue. Usually they are located under the mucosa, and these are nodules, as you can see here. All these are lymphocytes, and the central area, the right area, which is called germinal center, they are lymphocytes that have, like B lymphocytes, they develop into plasma cells whenever there is an immune response. So it's called the germinal center. There's high proliferation of lymphocytes taking place here. And this is a section of the appendix, the vermiform appendix. So the vermiform appendix has a very high concentration of lymphoid follicles just underneath the mucosa. The same thing is true for the terminal ileum. Again, and the region here, these lymphoid follicles that are present in the terminal ileum, they have a special name. They are called Peyer's patches. Peyer's patches. So this type of lymphoid nodules that are located under the mucosa, they have a special name which are called mucosa-associated lymphoid tissue. So they are called MALT, M-A-L-T, mucosa-associated lymphoid tissue. As I said, they are present in the respiratory system, in the urinary system, in the GI. In the GI, sometimes they are called the GALT, which is the gut-associated lymphoid tissue. It's just part of the MALT. And they could be in the form of the vermiform appendix, or in the form of Peyer's patches, or in the form of the tonsils that we have at the beginning of our respiratory and digestive passage. We have studied, I'm sure that we have studied these before. The palatine, the adenoid, the lingual tonsils, that they form a ring at the beginning of the respiratory and digestive passages. This ring of lymphoid tissue, protective ring, has a special name called Waldeyer's ring. If you go back to the lecture on the respiratory system, you will find it. And then we have the lymphoid tissue that is encapsulated. That's to say, it has a capsule of connective tissue. These are non-encapsulated. The nodules are non-encapsulated, but the lymph node is encapsulated. And you can see here the lymph node, they are large, sometimes 1 centimeter or maybe 1 inch or more in diameter. And you can see that there are multiple vessels connected to the lymph node. They are present in many places in the body, but usually they are concentrated. So they are concentrated, for example, in the inguinal region here, where they can be palpable if they are enlarged. Usually they are enlarged in case of tumor or in case of infection, not necessarily tumor, but infection. And inguinal, or they are present in the axilla. But they are present everywhere, in many other places in the body. They are present in the neck. Again, they can be palpable. They can be palpable in the axilla. But they are present in the mediastinum, where you cannot palpate them. Also, they are present in the abdomen. Again, you cannot palpate them. That's why we always concentrate on collections of lymph nodes where you can palpate when you examine a patient. So they are mainly in the axilla, in the neck, and in the groin, or in the inguinal region. This is how the lymph node looks like. It's an encapsulated, so it has a stroma or a capsule of connective tissue. And you can see here that the capsule sends trabeculae, which divides the lymph node into smaller compartments. And it has 2 regions, a cortex and medulla. The striking thing here, if you look at these vessels, that there are some vessels which are afferent lymphatic vessels. That's to say, they bring the lymph to the lymph node. And then here, there is 1 or 2 efferent lymphatic vessels. They take the lymph out of the lymph node. In other words, these lymph nodes, actually, their function is that they act like a filter for the lymph. The lymph is brought by afferent lymphatic vessels. It goes into these regions of the lymph node, the cortex, the medulla, and here it's going to be filtered by the lymphatic follicles that are present inside, which contain B lymphocytes, macrophages, T lymphocytes. So either antibodies are produced or they are phagocytized by these lymphatic cells. And then the filtered lymph is passing through the efferent lymphatic vessel and might go to another lymph node, or ultimately it's going to reach the vascular circulation, the veins. So in other words, the structure of the lymph node makes it behave like a filter for the lymph. So it has a parenchyma, as I said, that it's in the form of cortex, which contains lymphatic nodules, and these nodules contain lymphocytes. In the outer part of the cortex, these are B lymphocytes, and when they are activated, like this lymph that is brought to the lymph node can contain it can contain a malignant cell, or it can contain bacteria or virus. So it will activate this, act like an antigen, which will activate these lymphoid follicles, and so they will form plasma cells to produce antigens. The macrophages try to phagocytize the antigen. This is another way of reaction. And there are also, in the deeper part of the cortex, there are T lymphocytes as well that will produce killer cells. And then we have the central part, which is called the medulla. It doesn't have lymphoid nodules, but it has what we call cords of lymphoid tissue again. And then the lymph, therefore the lymph will come from an afferent lymph vessel, will be filtered here in the cortex, in the deeper cortex, in the medulla, and then leaves. So if it has any antigen inside it, it will trigger an immune reaction. This is again to show you the function. It acts as a filter for lymph, as I mentioned. And whenever there is metastasis, like tumor cells metastasize, these tumor cells, malignant cells, they can have easy access to the lymphatic capillary in comparison to the blood capillary, because the reason we mentioned that it's easier for large particles to go into the lymph. And so when they are the lymphatic vessel is going to filter the lymph in the lymph node, these cells are going to settle there and multiply, and this is how metastasis takes place. Okay, so that's why in many organs of the body you have to know where is the lymph node, where are the lymph nodes that drain that structure are located. Like for example, in the breast, it is most of the lymph from the breast, not all, but most of it is drained into the axillary lymph node. So when these lymph nodes, when there's tumor in the breast, then these lymph nodes will get enlarged. Not necessarily enlargement of an axillary lymph node means that there's a tumor in the breast. It might be an infection in the breast where the lymph node also enlarges but becomes tender. While the malignant lymph nodes, or metastatic, where there's metastasis is there, it is usually not tender. But the tender ones means infection. Axillary lymph nodes not only drain the breast, but also they drain the entire upper limb. So sometimes you might have a pinprick infection in the one of the fingers that results in the infection going up all the way to the axilla and result in enlargement of the axillary lymph nodes. So there are many reasons that these axillary lymph nodes are enlarged depending on the area they drain. The other lymphatic structure is the spleen. And the spleen is located in the abdomen. You can see it here. This is the diaphragm. This is a dissection showing you the diaphragm. This is the stomach, a little bit tilted away, and that is the spleen. Almost it can be held by the hand. The size of the spleen, it can be held in the hand. And this region in the abdomen, if you remember the 9 regions of the abdominal wall, this is called the the left hypochondrium. This is on the left side, left hypochondrium, just below the diaphragm. And it's in close proximity, therefore, to the lower ribs. Lower ribs are closely related to the spleen. Not directly related, but closely related, because the diaphragm separates between them. But the diaphragm is a thin, very thin muscle. The spleen has a surface that is close to the viscera, so we call it the visceral surface, and it is through this visceral surface that there's a hilum where structures pass in, out, and out of the spleen. So we have a splenic artery and splenic vein. And these are very important for the function of the spleen. because the spleen, if you compare the spleen with the lymph node is a filter for lymph. It has afferent and efferent lymphatic vessels. The spleen is a filter for the blood. So anything that is present in the blood that can induce an immune response will induce that in the spleen. So the spleen, again, it has a capsule of connective tissue. There are trabeculae and a meshwork of reticular fibers inside it, but there's no cortex or medulla. There are lymphatic nodules everywhere, as you can see here. This is a lymphatic nodule. The nodules are not segregated into cortex like in the lymph node, but they are present all inside the spleen, everywhere in the spleen, and they constitute what we call the white pulp, in contrast to the other part of the spleen, which is the red pulp that is mainly containing blood. So there are two pulps, a white pulp, which is formed mainly of lymphocytes and macrophages, and if you look at this white pulp, or what we call a lymphoid nodule, like in the center or sometimes eccentrically, there is a central artery. This artery is a branch of the splenic artery that entered the spleen from here and becomes smaller and smaller branches. And so the blood will be filtered from this central artery and goes into the white pulp surrounding the artery. The white pulp has lymphocytes, macrophages. If anything wrong is present in the blood, then it will be attacked. It will induce an immune reaction here. And then this blood should return back. So here we have blood lakes everywhere. It's the entire blood. So there are lakes of blood inside the spleen. And so these lakes of blood, which are called sinusoids, vascular sinusoids, they constitute the red pulp of the spleen. And then the blood will return to the venous circulation. In the red pulp of the spleen, there are also macrophages, and these macrophages, therefore, will attack not only the bacteria, but will attack the old RBCs, the worn out RBCs. That you know that the RBC has 120 days to live, and then it will be destroyed. So they will be destroyed here. If there are worn out platelets, if there are worn out RBCs, then they will be destroyed here. So that's why in many blood diseases that require that the RBCs or platelets are abnormal and they should be attacked and removed, the patient will have what we call splenomegaly, enlargement of the spleen, because the spleen is continuously active in removing these worn out RBCs or platelets. It will become enlarged and become palpable in the abdomen. So here, again, I would like to repeat that if you look at the lymph node is a filter for lymph. Lymph comes from here and goes through there, through the efferent, and meanwhile it's going to be filtered in the lymph node. The lymph node has a cortex and medulla, but the spleen is a filter for blood, and the blood will go from a white pulp to a red pulp. The white pulp and red pulp are present all around the spleen, in a section of a spleen. They are not segregated into an outer portion and an inner portion. And the spleen, because it contains all these lakes of blood, so it is so friable and can be easily damaged. And when it is damaged, it results in a very severe bleeding, because it's nothing but a filter, a sieve for blood. And damage of the spleen can result from a blow on the or a fracture of the rib, like you can see here, for example. This is a lower rib which has been cracked, and this will result in rupture of the spleen. Or sometimes it's just a blunt trauma, like after a car accident, something hitting the abdomen. It's a blunt trauma. There's no penetration, no fracture, but the high pressure that is produced will result in rupture of the spleen. This is very dangerous because it results in a very severe bleeding, internal bleeding. And the problem here is that because the spleen is so fragile and friable, the spleen cannot be sutured. So it has to be removed. If it is injured, if it is ruptured, it has to be removed. Okay? Finally is the thymus gland. The thymus, we have studied the thymus before, as I mentioned, as part of the endocrine system. And it's large in infants. We mentioned that before. You can compare the size of the thymus here in an infant or a fetus to the size of the heart, and then compare it in the adult. So you can see that it is very small in the adult. It is large in the infant. It has two lobes. The lobes, as you can see them here in the infant, they look like the leaves of thyme. Thyme is a kind of Mediterranean herbs like oregano or basil, so it's called thyme. Have you eaten that before? Yeah. So these are the thyme leaves. They look like the lobes of the thymus. That's why the thymus is called thymus, after thyme. It has, again, a capsule of connective tissue with trabeculae dividing it into lobules. So it has small lobules, and in each lobule there is a cortex and medulla. Medulla is where the mature cells, here remember, in the thymus there is maturation, not only proliferation, but maturation of T cells. T cells develop in the bone marrow, they move to the thymus, they will become mature. What causes this maturation is that there are other cells in the thymus, apart from the lymphocytes. There are thymic cells, which are epithelial cells. They are called thymic cells that produce a hormone called thymosin. That's why it's an endocrine gland. And this hormone is essential for the maturation of the T lymphocytes. So part of it is endocrine, it produces a hormone, and the other part it is a lymphoid tissue where it's a primary lymphoid organ where lymphocytes become mature here. And the lymphocytes that fail to mature, because they come from the red bone marrow, and the process of maturation might be faulty. These faulty lymphocytes that did not mature in the correct way, they will be attacked and killed by macrophages, which are present here, and will be dumped in the medulla. Somewhere in the medulla, we have what we call thymic corpuscles. So these thymic corpuscles, is the dump area of these wrongly developed lymphocytes, T lymphocytes. Okay, this is actually it's a theory. It's not completely true. Partly it's true, and still the function of these thymic corpuscles is not very clear until now. There's a lot of research going on, but one of the theories that these are the dumped, wrongly developed or faultily developed lymphocytes. Okay? Questions? Yes.